The autumn rain hammered against the windows of Millfield Station like an angry fist, each drop echoing through the nearly empty waiting room. At 62, Frank Morrison had seen plenty of storms roll through this corner of Montana, but tonight felt different. The wind carried something unsettling, a restlessness that made his old bones ache with more than just the approaching winter. Frank adjusted his worn leather jacket and glanced at the large clock above the ticket counter. 9:47 p.m. The last train had departed 3 hours ago, heading east toward Chicago, leaving behind only the lingering scent of coal smoke and the hollow echo of distant memories. As the station's night security guard for the past 15 years, Frank had grown accustomed to the solitude, but tonight, something or someone had broken that familiar silence. She sat hunched on the far end of the wooden bench, a figure so still she might have been carved from shadow itself. Her dark hair, streaked with premature silver, fell like a curtain around her face, and her clothes a simple blue dress and thin cardigan afforded little protection against the October chill seeping through the station's old walls. Frank had noticed her hours ago when the 6:30 train pulled away without her. She'd stood on the platform, watching the red taillights disappear into the Montana darkness, her shoulders sagging with what looked like defeat. Since then, she hadn't moved except to occasionally wipe her eyes with a crumpled tissue. The storm intensified, and Frank could hear the old building creaking under the assault. He'd seen stranded passengers before missed connections, cancelled trains, family emergencies, but something about this woman's stillness troubled him. There was a quality to her grief that spoke of deeper wounds than a simple travel mishap. "Ma'am." Frank's voice carried gently across the empty space. "The station's closing soon. Is there someone you're waiting for?" She looked up, and Frank saw eyes that had seen too much the kind of weariness that came not from a long day, but from a long life of carrying burdens meant for stronger shoulders. She appeared to be in her mid-50s, with fine lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and tears in equal measure. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize. I can go." "Now, hold on," Frank said, moving closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "I'm not kicking you out into this storm. The name's Frank Morrison. I work here nights. Just wondering if there's anything I can do to help." She studied his weathered face, seeming to weigh something in her mind. "I'm Catherine," she said finally. "Catherine Welsh, and I'm not really sure where I'm supposed to go." The way she said it made Frank's chest tighten. This wasn't about missing a train or needing directions. This was about a woman who had somehow lost her way in life itself. "Well, Catherine Welsh, how about we start with something simple? When's the last time you had a hot meal?" She shook her head. "I'm not hungry." "That wasn't what I asked." Frank's tone was gentle but firm, the way he'd spoken to his own daughter during her troubled teenage years. Sometimes our bodies need fuel even when our hearts don't want it. Catherine's composure cracked slightly, and she pressed the tissue to her eyes again. "I left my husband today," she whispered. "After 32 years. I got on that train in Billings, but when it stopped here, I couldn't go any further. I don't know where I belong anymore." Frank felt the familiar stirring in his chest. Same protective instinct that had made him a good father and, before that, a decent soldier in Vietnam. Life had taught him that sometimes people needed saving, and sometimes you were the only one around to do it. "Catherine, I don't know your story, and I won't pretend to understand what brought you to this bench tonight. But I do know that nobody should spend a night like this, alone in a train station? He paused, choosing his words carefully. My shift ends in about an hour. I've got a small place about 10 minutes from here, with a spare room and a kitchen that makes a decent cup of coffee. It's not much, but it's warm and safe. She looked at him with surprise and something that might have been hope. I couldn't impose on a stranger like that. Ma'am, I've been walking this earth for 62 years, and I've learned that strangers are just friends whose stories you haven't heard yet. Frank smiled, the expression transforming his grizzled features. Besides, my late wife Martha would haunt me something fierce if I left a lady stranded in a storm. Catherine managed a small smile at that, the first Frank had seen from her all evening. Your wife sounds like she was a wonderful woman. She was, indeed. Been gone 8 years now, but I still hear her voice clear as day. Usually when I'm about to do something foolish or forget to eat vegetables. Frank chuckled softly. She always said God puts people in our path for a reason. Maybe you and I were meant to cross paths tonight. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows with renewed fury, as if the storm itself was urging Catherine to accept this unexpected kindness. Okay, she said quietly. Thank you, Frank. I'd be grateful for a warm place tonight. As Frank gathered his things and prepared to close the station, he couldn't shake the feeling that this night would change both their lives in ways neither could imagine. Sometimes salvation came in the form of grand gestures, but more often, it arrived as simply as a stranger offering shelter from the storm. Frank's house sat at the end of Pine Ridge Road, a modest 2-story structure with weathered cedar siding and windows that glowed warmly against the stormy night. As they pulled into the gravel driveway, Catherine felt a strange mix of gratitude and vulnerability. The rain had intensified during their short drive, and Frank had filled the silence with gentle observations about the town's history, clearly trying to put her at ease. Built this place with my own hands in 1987, Frank said as they hurried through the rain to the covered porch. Martha designed it, said she wanted a house that felt like a hug. Inside, Catherine could see what Martha had meant. The living room was filled with comfortable furniture, family photographs, and the kind of lived-in warmth that only comes from decades of genuine happiness. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and Frank immediately set about building a fire, his movements practiced and sure. Coffee, tea, or something stronger? He asked, hanging up their damp coats. Coffee would be wonderful, Catherine replied, settling carefully onto the edge of the sofa as if she might flee at any moment. From the kitchen came the sounds of Frank preparing their drinks, and Catherine found herself studying the photographs that covered the mantelpiece. A wedding picture from what looked like the 1970s showed a younger Frank with a radiant blonde woman. Other photos chronicled the years, holidays, birthdays, a daughter's graduation, grandchildren. That's Sarah, our daughter, Frank said, returning, with 2 steaming mugs. She lives in Portland now with her family, visits every few months, brings the grandkids. This house gets pretty quiet between those visits. Catherine accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. They look happy, your family. We were blessed, Frank said simply, settling into his recliner. But I imagine you had happy times too, before whatever happened today. Catherine stared into her coffee for a long moment. We did. James and I, we met in college. He was studying agriculture, wanted to run his father's ranch. I was an art teacher. We had such dreams. Her voice carried the weight of decades. But somewhere along the way, dreams turn into routines, and routines turn into ... existing. Frank waited, recognizing the need for silence that comes before difficult truths. He never hit me, Catherine continued, as if she needed to clarify. James isn't a bad man, but he stopped seeing me years ago. I became just another part of the ranch, useful, reliable, but not really ... present. When I tried to talk to him about it, he'd say I was being dramatic, that we had a good life. And we did, on paper. Nice house, financial security, respect in the community. But you were disappearing, Frank said quietly. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. Exactly. I stopped painting 15 years ago. Stopped reading the books I loved. Stopped having opinions about anything beyond meal planning and social obligations. This morning, I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence between them. What finally made you leave? Frank asked. Catherine set down her coffee with trembling hands. Yesterday was our wedding anniversary. 32 years. I'd been planning for weeks, thinking maybe if I could recreate some of the magic from our early days. I made his favorite dinner, wore the dress I wore on our first anniversary. She paused, composing herself. He came in from the barn, ate in silence, then fell asleep in front of the television. Didn't even remember what day it was. Frank felt a familiar ache in his chest. That must have been devastating. I sat there, watching him sleep, and I realized I'd been mourning the death of our marriage for years, without even knowing it. So this morning, while he was out checking cattle, I packed a suitcase and drove to the train station in Billings. I bought a ticket to Chicago because my sister lives there, but when the train stopped here, ... She shrugged helplessly. I just couldn't face explaining to Linda why I'd thrown away what everyone thinks is a perfect marriage. Frank leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. Catherine, can I tell you something? I lost Martha to cancer 8 years ago, and I'd give anything for one more ordinary evening with her. But here's what I learned. There's a world of difference between losing someone to death and losing them to indifference. At least, I have beautiful memories. You've been living with the ghost of your marriage for years. Catherine wiped her eyes with a tissue Frank had quietly handed her. I feel so foolish. At 54, starting over seems impossible. Foolish. Frank shook his head firmly. You know what's foolish? Spending the rest of your life as a shadow of who you're meant to be. You said you were an art teacher. What kind of art did you do? Watercolors, mostly landscapes. I used to paint the changing seasons on the ranch, the way the light fell across the wheat fields. For the first time that evening, Catherine's voice carried a note of warmth. I had a studio in the barn loft. James converted it to storage about 10 years ago. Frank stood up and walked to a bookshelf, returning with a photo album. I want to show you something. He opened it to a page filled with vibrant landscape paintings. Martha painted these, took it up after she retired from teaching, said art helped her see the world with fresh eyes every day. Catherine studied the paintings, her trained eye immediately recognizing the skill and passion in each brushstroke. These are beautiful. She had real talent. She started painting at 60, Frank said. Said it was never too late to nurture the parts of yourself that had been waiting patiently for their turn. As the storm continued to rage outside, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The stirring of possibility. Maybe her story wasn't over. Maybe it was just waiting for a new chapter to begin. Morning broke clear and crisp over Millfield, the storm having swept away the autumn heat and left behind the kind of crystalline air that made everything seem sharper, more vivid. Catherine woke in Frank's guest room feeling more rested than she had in months. Despite the emotional upheaval of the previous day, the smell of bacon and coffee drew her downstairs, where she found Frank at the stove, humming an old country tune. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the golden air. "Morning," Frank said with a smile. "Hope you like your eggs over easy. Martha always said it was the only civilized way to cook them." "That's perfect, thank you." Catherine accepted a cup of coffee and settled at the small kitchen table. "Frank, I can't tell you how much your kindness means to me. I was in a very dark place last night. Sometimes we all need someone to throw us a lifeline," Frank replied, plating their breakfast. "The question now is, what comes next?" Catherine had been asking herself the same thing since she'd awakened. "I suppose I should buy another train ticket to Chicago. Face the music with my sister." Frank set her plate down and took the seat across from her. "Can I ask you something? When you got off that train yesterday, was it really because you couldn't face your sister, or was it something else?" Catherine paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. "What do you mean?" "Well, from what you've told me about Linda, she sounds like the kind of sister who'd support you no matter what. So maybe the real reason you couldn't continue that journey was because Chicago isn't where you're supposed to be." The observation hit Catherine with unexpected force. I hadn't thought of it that way. "Sometimes our bodies know things before our minds catch up," Frank said gently. "Maybe you got off that train because this is where you need to be right now." Catherine looked out the kitchen window at the Montana landscape, seeing it with fresh eyes. The rolling hills seemed to stretch endlessly towards snow-capped mountains in the distance, and there was something about the vastness that made her feel both small and infinite at the same time. "I don't even know what I'd do here," she said. "I have no job, no connections, nowhere to live." Frank set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Catherine, I'm going to tell you something I haven't shared with anyone, not even Sarah. Last month, I went to see Doc Henderson about some tests I'd been putting off. The results, well, let's just say they've given me some perspective on how I want to spend whatever time I have left." Catherine's heart clenched. "Frank, are you... "I'm not dying tomorrow," Frank said quickly. "But I'm not a young man, and I've got some decisions to make. This house is too big for one person, and I've been thinking about what Martha would want me to do with it. She always said a home should be filled with life and purpose." He stood up and walked to the window, his back to Catherine. "There's something else you should know. The reason I was working at the train station wasn't because I needed the money. It was because I was running from this empty house, from the memories, from the loneliness. But meeting you last night reminded me that sometimes the best way to heal your own wounds is to help someone else heal theirs." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. "What are you saying?" Frank turned back to her, his expression serious but hopeful. "I'm saying maybe we can help each other. You need time and space to figure out who you are when you're not being someone's wife. I need to remember what it feels like to have purpose beyond just getting through each day. This house has a sunroom on the second floor that gets perfect light. Martha always said it would make a beautiful art studio. The offer hung in the air between them, too generous and too perfect to be real. Frank, I couldn't possibly let me finish," Frank said, holding up his hand. "I'm not talking about charity. Millfield Elementary is looking for a part-time art teacher. The pay isn't much, but it would cover your expenses. And I could use help around here, cooking, light housekeeping, someone to make sure I take my medications and don't live entirely on frozen dinners." Catherine stared at him, overwhelmed by the possibility he was offering. "You barely know me. How can you trust me with your home?" Frank smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Catherine, in my 62 years, I've learned to trust my instincts about people. And my instincts tell me that you're exactly the kind of person Martha would have welcomed with open arms. She always believed that God puts people in our paths when we need them most. But what if I'm not ready? What if I fail at this independence thing and end up crawling back to James? Then you'll have learned something important about yourself," Frank said simply. "But my gut tells me that's not going to happen. I see strength in you, Catherine. You just need time to remember it's there." Catherine looked round the warm kitchen, imagining mornings like this one, conversations over coffee, the possibility of purpose beyond mere survival. For the first time in years, she could envision a future that belonged entirely to her. "The sunroom," she said quietly. "Could I see it?" Frank's smile widened into a grin. "I thought you'd never ask." As they climbed the stairs together, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, the thrilling terror of stepping into the unknown, armed with nothing but hope and the kindness of a stranger who was rapidly becoming something much more precious, a friend. 3 months later, the sunroom had been transformed into everything Catherine had dreamed an art studio could be. Easels stood at different angles to catch the changing light throughout the day, and the walls were lined with her latest paintings, watercolors that captured the Montana landscape with a vibrancy she'd forgotten she possessed. Frank stood in the doorway, watching Catherine put the finishing touches on a painting of the train station, the late afternoon sun catching the silver streaks in her hair. The transformation in her over these months had been remarkable. The defeated woman he'd met that stormy October night had been replaced by someone with purpose, confidence, and joy radiating from every brushstroke. "That's beautiful," Frank said, moving closer to examine the painting. "You've captured something. I never noticed before the way the light hits the platform makes it look almost hopeful, like a place where good things happen instead of just departures." Catherine smiled, setting down her brush. "That's because good things do happen there. At least, they did for me." Their comfortable routine had evolved naturally over the months. Catherine taught art at the elementary school 3 days a week, her enthusiasm infectious among students who had never before considered that creativity was as important as any other subject. The rest of her time was spent painting, helping Frank with the house, and slowly building a life that was entirely her own. She'd spoken to James twice since leaving, difficult conversations that confirmed what she'd already known. He wanted her to come home, to return to their old life, but he couldn't understand why she'd been unhappy or what needed to change. The divorce papers had been finalized the week before, a necessary sadness that felt more like closure than loss. "Frank," Catherine said, cleaning her brushes, "I need to tell you something." He settled into the comfortable chair they'd moved up to the studio, noting the serious tone in her voice. "What's on your mind?" "I got a call from Linda yesterday. She's planning to visit next month, and she asked if I was ready to come back to Chicago with her. Said she could help me find an apartment, maybe get connected with the art community there." Frank felt his heart skip, but kept his expression neutral. "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity." Catherine set down her brushes and turned to face him fully. "It is, and 3 months ago, I would have said yes, immediately. Chicago has everything I thought I wanted: museums, galleries, cultural opportunities, family. But, Frank prompted gently, but I've discovered something here that I never expected to find. Catherine's voice grew stronger as she spoke. I've found home. Not just a place to live, but a real home. With you, with the students, with this community that's welcomed me like I've always belonged here. Frank felt warmth spread through his chest. Catherine, you know you're welcome to stay as long as you want. This house hasn't felt like a home since Martha died, but these past months, ... It's alive again. There's something else, Catherine said, her cheeks coloring slightly. I've been thinking about what you said that first night, about how people come into our lives when we need them most. You saved me, Frank, but I think maybe I helped save you too. Frank's eyes grew misty. You've given me more than you know. Purpose, companionship, laughter. You've reminded me that life isn't over just because one chapter ends. Catherine moved closer, reaching for his weathered hands. Then let's write the next chapter together. Not as strangers sharing a house, but as family. Real family, are you sure? Frank asked, his voice thick with emotion. It's a big decision, choosing to build a life here. Catherine smiled, the expression radiant with certainty. Frank, I spent 32 years in a marriage where I was slowly disappearing. These past 3 months, I've remembered who I am. I'm an artist, a teacher, a woman who deserves to be seen and valued for who she really is. And you see me. You've seen me from that very first night. Frank squeezed her hands gently. Martha would have loved you. She always said the best families are the ones we choose, not just the ones we're born into. I'd like to hear more stories about her, Catherine said. I want to know about the woman who helped shape the man who saved me. I'll tell you everything, Frank promised. We've got time. As the sun set over the Montana landscape, painting the sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold, Catherine and Frank sat together in comfortable silence, to people who had found salvation in the most unexpected place. The train station where they'd met continued to serve its purpose, not just as a place of departures, but as a destination where lost souls could find their way home. Outside, the evening train whistle echoed across the valley, a sound that once represented escape but now felt like a blessing. A reminder of the night when a stranger's kindness and a woman's courage had created something beautiful from the ashes of the past. Catherine picked up her brush again, adding final touches to her painting of the station. Tomorrow, she would start a new canvas portrait of the family she'd chosen and the home she'd found in the most unlikely of places. Because sometimes the most important journeys aren't about reaching your destination, but about discovering that where you are is exactly where you belong.